interest in ecology, equally strong interest in conservation, and a desire to be able to combine the ecological sciences with the social sciences to really understand across their full range of dimensions various conservation problems related to biodiversity. He also came with a particular affection for elephants. And this is not an uncommon situation. Elephants exert a deep draw on a number of ecologists, and we can all be grateful for that. Nitin, for the more ecological side of his dissertation, focused on the question of the role that Asian elephants play in the dispersal of several species of trees whose large fruits are consumed by elephants. And this is actually a very complicated question to address because it requires you to know something about the ecology of the trees, something about the ecology of the elephants, and also all of the animals, all the other animals that could potentially eat and disperse the seeds of those trees. So it really requires you to engage in a multi-species analysis and to address a what-if question of what if there were no elephants. And out of that work, Nitin produced a really lovely series of papers focusing on the role that Asian elephants play in the dispersal of these trees, and in turn how that compares to the dispersal services provided by, for example, domestic livestock, which some people hope will act as a substitute for elephants. For the more social side, the social science side of Nitin's interest, he was interested in the issues of park management, conservation of endangered species, in particular the tiger, and that interplay of people with potentially dangerous wildlife with park bureaucracy trying to balance the needs of people with the needs of wildlife. And it is that latter part of his work that you will be talking about this afternoon. So it is a pleasure to welcome back Nitin Sekar.
Thanks very much for the introduction, David. You really know how to stretch a resume. It's a huge honor for me to be here today as a speaker, since I've been here as an audience member so many times. And so I want to start this talk by confessing that it's not really about tigers. So, sorry, yeah. So kind of a lure to get you here. Tigers are sort of the unseen character in my story today, and they're at the beginning and the end of my talk. But this is really a story about the sacrifices we ask the most vulnerable people in our society to make for wildlife conservation, and what needs to be done to balance the sometimes dueling imperatives of human rights and saving our natural heritage. So, that's not very fun, apparently. So, as many of you know, space is quite limited in India. We have over 1.2 billion people there. Yet somehow, miraculously, India also has the largest population of wild tigers in the world, estimated around 1,700 people. Most of these tigers are thought to live in 42 tiger reserves scattered around the country. The protected areas of India encapsulate about 5% of the area of the country. Yet even in these tiger reserves, there are people. Tiger reserves contain about 1,500 villages, and about 325,000 people are thought to live there. Now, most of these people are Indian tribals that are known as Adivasis. And so the Adivasis are sort of like the American Indians of India. So they're the indigenous people that were thought to live in India before agriculturalists and other people migrated in. And even in the last several decades, they've continued to often lead lifestyles of hunter-gatherers and subsistence farmers. And they've historically been exploited by everyone when the opportunity arose, including upper caste Indians and by the British. And so what to do with Adivasis living in protected areas is a big debate in India. On the one hand, you have human rights and tribal activists who believe that Adivasis are the stewards of India's remaining forests. And the general belief is well captured in this quote. So Stephen Corey of Survival International says, The vast majority of the world's best conservation areas are home to tribal peoples. This is no coincidence. It is madness to suggest that the best way to preserve wildlife is to evict the very people who have protected it for so many years. But on the other hand, ecologists have found evidence that villagers living in protected areas and tiger reserves do disturb the landscape. So Preeti found, for instance, that a village of even 300 people, by collecting firewood and grazing their cattle in the area around their village, led to an increase in exposed soil, more invasive species, and they created this kind of envelope of disturbed habitat, about 1729 square kilometers around their village. And in this particular tiger reserve, having 13 villages affected up to 20% of the tiger reserve. In addition, villagers that maybe work in the forest occasionally poach animals and set fires while they're collecting non-timber forest products. So anyway, this debate's far from settled, and it goes on in India today. But in the late 1960s, Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister of India, decided that people were probably not very good for the country's remaining tigers. At that point, there had been a precipitous drop, and there were only about 1,800 tigers left. So Prime Minister Gandhi established Project Tiger, and from 1969 to 2001, India's protected areas increased about an order of magnitude in area. And even though the law was actually quite ambiguous about what should be done with tribal people living in these protected areas, the state used the expansion of tiger reserves as justification to relocate a bunch of villages forcefully. So they moved at least 80 villages and 2,900 families from tiger reserves between 1973 and 2006. So now conservationists in the country said, these relocations should actually probably be a good thing for these Adivasis. They pointed out that many of the Adivasis would get compensation packages when they moved, including land and money. And they also said that once you're outside the forest, you should have more access to modern infrastructure, services, and markets instead of what you have when you're inside a jungle. But the empirical data unfortunately shows that relocations have instead resulted in impoverishment and destitution. So for instance, the Gond tribals of Padoba were largely dependent on non-timber forest products when they're living in the tiger reserve. And naturally, when they're moved away from the forest, they no longer were able to practice that livelihood. Similarly, the Maldadis of Gir grazed cattle, and when they no longer had access to tiger reserve, they had no place to graze their animals. And so, by and large, if you look at the data and the narrative from 21 tiger reserves across the last several decades, they're overwhelmingly negative. And so the natural question then is why? Why do relocations fail socioeconomically? Rangarajan and Shalpuddin did the most comprehensive sort of historical evaluation of this, and they suggest several proximate causes. They note that the government doesn't usually have much transparency when they're executing these relocations, which makes it hard for anyone to know what they're doing. They don't really engage local stakeholders, so if there's something going wrong on the ground, they're not able to know that. There's no feedback mechanism. They often also don't have enough money to actually do relocations well. And they almost never involve sociologists or anthropologists or any other experts. These are government bureaucrats doing what they think makes sense for relocation. And Lascourse and Qatari add some cultural factors. They point out that Adivasis are used to living off the land, and for them, suddenly being shoved into a largely market economy is probably not going to work well for them. And I think we have trouble kind of realizing the second thing. We're very mobile as a culture, but these Adivasis are actually quite attached to their land. A big part of their identity may actually be their geographic location. And so moving them can have adverse consequences. But these are mostly proximate causes, and I find the most sort of compelling ultimate cause or explanation to come from Asmita Kabra, who is an economist who did 2 case studies on relocations. One in Badr Wildlife Sanctuary, where there was an actually successful relocation of non-tribal people, and one in Kuno Wildlife Sanctuary, where there was a more typical relocation of tribal people. So in Badra, the upper caste villagers, when they relocated, received irrigated land, they got cash compensation, and they got electricity connections and a school. And you kind of even see in the picture on the top right there, as far as India goes, it looks like a pretty good place to live. In contrast, in Kuno Wildlife Sanctuary, the Saharia tribals received poor quality land that was unirrigated. 10 years after the relocation, they were yet to receive compensation, and many were earning less than a subsistence level of income, which in India is already a very low bar. And so what Dr. Kabra suggested is that the Badra villagers had several assets that made their relocation more successful. One is that this really great NGO led by Ulas Karam, who's a tiger conservationist, was involved, and they helped make sure that the relocation went well. But the other kind of deeper reason was that the villagers in Badr were politically empowered to resist the relocation until it was on their terms. They actually the state had been trying to get them to relocate for a couple of decades, but they were able to postpone that until they got a good deal. And so the theory is then that Adivasis also, if given the political tools to resist relocations until they receive favorable terms, may be able to relocate successfully. In Badr, the villagers, for instance, had relatives that were in the government. That allowed them some leverage, and they were able to negotiate with the government more successfully. However, the Adivasis typically don't have that representation. So then, how can Adivasis have those tools? Well, the Indian government passed this really progressive piece of legislation called the Scheduled Tribe and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Rights Act. I'll just call it the Forest Rights Act, or FRA for here now, in 2006. And so this is basically supposed to give tribal people living in any forest, including protected areas, a certain set of rights that will allow them to negotiate with the state. So I have a few of the most important ones listed here. According to the Forest Rights Act, if you are an Adivasi living in a forest, including a tiger reserve, and you've been farming land to feed your family before 2006, you can now get a certificate saying that you have the right to stay on that land and continue to farm. In addition, the Forest Rights Act provides tribal people community-based rights, forest rights. So if you live in a community that has been using non-timber forest products, that's been grazing your cattle in the tiger reserve, that's been collecting wood now and then to repair your home, you can continue to exercise, those become rights now, you can exercise those rights because you're just doing it to survive and you've been there for a long time. And perhaps most directly addressing the relocation issue, the Forest Rights Act says that relocation can no longer be forced. Tribal people cannot be relocated unless they have given their free, informed consent through their Gram Sabha. And the Gram Sabha is basically the so-called democratic decision-making body of the Indian village. It consists of all the adult men and women over 18 years of age in the village. So in theory now, the Forest Rights Act suggests that if there's going to be a relocation, it's going to be a voluntary village relocation, because the FRA grants villagers the formal right to live in the reserve. So now Adivasis are empowered to negotiate with the state until the state provides a package that will allow for a favorable relocation. And since the Gram Sabha is, in theory, a democratic body, any decision that comes from the Gram Sabha to relocate should be favorable to at least a majority of the relocated, if not maybe even all the villagers. It's supposed to be a consensus decision-making body. So this brings me to the central questions of my research. This voluntary village relocation program could perhaps provide an answer to the problem of indigenous people in protected areas, right? So I want to know whether the voluntary village relocations pursued by the Indian state provided a potential win-win solution to the problem of indigenous communities living in protected areas. And so I address kind of two main sub-questions here. One is whether the so-called voluntary village relocations were actually voluntary. So I wanted to go and talk to the actual villagers and figure out whether they'd actually given their free, informed consent. And the second question is whether these voluntary or so-called voluntary relocations actually improve the quality of life or the socioeconomic metrics of relocated families. So my study site was Melghat Tiger Reserve. So on the top right is that kind of little picture of India. That red dot is Melghat. So it's pretty much in the center of the country. And as far as tiger reserves go, it's pretty big in India. It's about 2,700 square kilometers. And I wanted to work in Melghat for a couple of reasons. First, they are said to have performed the earliest voluntary village relocations in India. So even before the Forest Rights Act, in 2000-2001, they relocated a small number of villages, and those villages were widely reported to be voluntary. So in my evaluation, this allows me to look at not just relocation that happened in the last 2 or 3 years and maybe too recent to really make a fair evaluation of. I could also look at relocation that happened over a decade ago. In addition, the populations that were relocated were mostly tribal people, which are the most vulnerable individuals in this area and the population of greatest concern. So I have to give you a little more history about the study site in order for a lot of my talk to make sense. So even though the Tiger Reserve was actually declared in 1973, the state didn't get around to really declaring the core area of the reserve until between 1985 and 1997. And so the core area is basically the part of the national park where human activity is basically forbidden. You're not supposed to have cattle herding or NTFP collection, non-timber forest products, or any such thing. And so what happened here essentially is you can kind of see there's the pink section. In 1985, that was originally the core area of the reserve. And then in the next 12 years, it spread to the orange, dark green, and purple areas. And so you can imagine what it's like to be a villager living in, say, the dark green part of the reserve. One year, you're just kind of herding your cattle and you're making ends meet. And then the next year, suddenly, it's illegal to do the things that you were doing to survive. Right? There wasn't really any community consultation in these progressions. So it was in this context, in 1999, that government officials had the first community consultations about voluntary relocation from the reserve. And so government officials, ranging from the joint secretary to the chief minister, who was a really high-ranking official, all the way down to the forest rangers that would actually be implementing the relocations, met with villagers and pro and anti-relocation NGOs. And they went to the villagers and they asked people from a bunch of different villages to come and ask, what would you need in order to make relocation worthwhile for you? And under what circumstances would you voluntarily relocate? And so villagers demanded 18 things for relocation. I'm not going to list them all, but some of the most important ones were at least a hectare of land per family for farming, at least 30,000 rupees per family to build a house, 60,000 rupees per family to irrigate their land, and then a bunch of community-level assets, such as public hand pumps, electricity supply, a drinking tank for livestock, and free Wi-Fi. So then in 2006, the Forest Rights Act was passed, as I mentioned. And so the state, in response, the National Tiger Conservation Authority, developed 2 relocation packages to offer tribal communities to entice them to relocate. So the first option initially was just to provide each family 1 million rupees, or 10 lakh. 1 lakh in Indian terms is 100,000, so 10 lakh is 1 million. And so they were just going to provide 1 million rupees to each family and let them do whatever they wanted. Tribal activists were concerned that people who had never handled more than a couple thousand rupees before in their lives would perhaps not be able to manage that much money. And they were also concerned that if the villagers went in their own direction and didn't go move as a community, they would be susceptible to exploitation by non-tribal peoples. So the Maharashtrian government made a couple of kind of ad hoc but important modifications to the package. First, they decided they'd only give the money in installments. So instead of giving it all at once, they'd give 1 or 2 lakh at a time. In addition, they would put half, about 500,000 rupees, in a fixed deposit account that would mature in 2018. And so the idea then is that these villagers can live off the interest of the 500,000 rupees month to month until they settle in. But in addition, if they found land, they were then allowed to withdraw the money to buy land or any other fixed asset like a tractor. If they had an opportunity to build a professional kind of existence, they could withdraw money for that. And in addition, the state took some money from each package and used it to pay for a small plot of land to which all the villages from one village could be relocated, and they could kind of set up camp. So that's the first option that the state would provide to villagers to get them to relocate. The second option was very much like the one I outlined from the 2000 and 2001 relocations. So they would provide about 2 hectares of land per family, 350,000 rupees per family for a house, for a home, and other things, plus community facilities that I mentioned earlier. And so in 2007 to 2008, the Maharashtra Forest Department actually went to a bunch of the villages in Melghat and offered them these packages, and pretty much all of them agreed to relocate. And except for a couple of villages I won't be talking about today, all of them chose package 1. So package 2 is kind of out of the picture for right now. So then from 2010 to 2013, the Post-Forest Rights Act relocations occurred. And in June of 2013, I got there to begin the study. Okay, so what were my methods? My methods, how did I assess the socioeconomic status of relocated and forest villages? So basically, I systematically visited a lot of homes, a lot of people, and talked to them. I wanted to be able to compare relocated villages to yet to be relocated villages, or what I call forest villages. So forest villages serve as sort of counterfactual or control group. And I also wanted to talk to villagers who had been relocated recently, 1 to 3 years ago, and those who had been relocated in the original relocations 10 years ago. So I selected 3 communities. The 3 communities that were initially relocated in 2000, the two communities that were relocated more recently, and 2 villages that are still in the forest. And I just also want to point out that, so I went, in each of these villages, I went to every 5th house, and I asked them a bunch of survey questions. I tried to talk to both men and women, so that's why I included those numbers there. And in total, I talked to 133 households. And so just to give you an idea of some of the questions I would ask, I asked, where do you go to use the toilet, and how much do you spend on food, spices, and other rations every week. So then, in addition to doing quantitative surveys, I did qualitative surveys to explore whether the relocations were actually voluntary and understand the decision-making process by which villagers decided to relocate. So in addition to revisiting the villages I mentioned earlier and 2 other recently relocated villages, I talked to 3 government officials and 4 NGO activists, 2 of whom were anti-relocation. And in total, I talked to 50 villagers across 9 villages. And an example question is that right there: how did the village make the decision to relocate? And then I would ask follow-up questions. Okay, so the first section of results have to do with whether the relocations were voluntary, and that is essentially whether the villages actually provided their free and informed consent. And so what consent is, legally, is sort of broadly agreed upon by all the parties here. They agree that consent occurs if the majority of the Gram Sabha, the adults in a village, agree to relocate by issuing a resolution saying that we want to relocate. And I actually assume that those resolutions exist because no one contests that, and getting paperwork from the government can be difficult. I did other stuff instead. Surprisingly, however, there's very little sort of written about what a free consent is or what informed consent is. And so I've kind of, based on my readings and talking to attorneys and officials, come up with these definitions. Said consent is free if villagers are asked if they wish to relocate, told they may stay if they want, and are allowed to stay hassle-free if they decide not to relocate. And I suggest that consent is informed if villagers are honestly notified about a few key elements of the relocation. First, they should know about their individual forest rights. Second, they should know about their community forest rights. Third, they should have an opportunity to see the plot to which they're going to be relocated if it happens. And fourth, they should get an honest account of the nature and timing of the compensation that they're going to receive. Right? And I should add here, before I go further, that the Forest Department fully believed that the relocations they were conducting were voluntary. They took me with them to the forest and involved me in meetings in which they showed me villagers saying, please relocate us as soon as possible, you let us go, we don't want to be here anymore. Then they allowed me unfettered access to the villages. They didn't send, when I said I don't want someone with me, they just let me go by myself so I wouldn't have any bias coming from having a government official with me. So they believe very strongly that these are voluntary relocations. So were they? The first question is whether the consent was free. So most villagers, when asked if they were free, said, if they were asked whether they want to relocate, said, yes, we were asked by the government whether we want to relocate. And Ambadas Takare is one villager from Darud, which is a post-FRA relocated village. And he said, the government said that if those of you who want to come are less than those of you who want to move, we won't move you. However, there were also a substantial number of reports of intimidation. So people saying that the state made them feel as though they didn't have any choice but to relocate. And these are the minority, but there are too many of them to ignore. For instance, Sekar said, the government says in order from above, your relocation has to be done, you have to leave the jungle. Now, it seemed to me that the latter cases generally occurred after the Gram Sabha had agreed to relocate, and a minority of villagers were saying, this isn't good for us, we don't want to do it. But I'm not sure about that. It's very hard to get the exact timing of events down. And in any case, this qualifies as intimidation by the state. So I still have to say, though, that almost all the villagers, even those opposed to relocations, and those who said that they didn't enjoy the effects of the relocation, said that the relocations happened in part because the majority of their village wanted to go. And this is probably in part because the majority of villagers in each village were landless. So for them, they were living in a jungle, in a place where they weren't allowed to do very much, and they had no land, they had no assets. For them, 1 million rupees is a good deal, right? Or feels like a good deal. Whereas the landed people who were living in the jungle were attached to their land, and they knew that if they were relocated, they may not end up with the same situation. They were more resistant. But since they were in the minority, things didn't usually shake out in their favor. In addition, I want to note that I've found many instances of villagers successfully resisting relocation. So in Koha, in one of the early relocated villages, they apparently resisted relocation until they got a site they liked. In Somtanakur, which is a community with a higher proportion of landed families, villagers said that their reluctance to relocate stalled the relocation, and the state relocated other villagers instead. And most interestingly, one gentleman said that local politicians and activists visited his village and tried to persuade the villagers to stay. In his opinion, the politicians didn't want them to go because if they left, they lost a vote bank. Right? These were people that would have voted for them if they stuck around. So he said it was their profit for us to stay, it was our loss. And so he was in favor of the relocation. But what's interesting here is a couple things. First of all, the villagers seem to know that they have the option to relocate. They have, relatively powerful people, including local politicians, telling them that they can stay. And in addition, they had the support of local politicians if they wanted to stay. So overall, my assessment is that since the villagers were generally believe that the majority of villagers wanted to relocate, and there's so many examples of successful resistance, they get a check minus for freeness of relocation. Because the instance of intimidation could not be ignored, they don't get the check plus. So the next question is, was consent informed? So I really don't think there's any way to say that it was. There's no reasonable standard for informed that the relocations met. So, for instance, villagers, even though some villagers had gotten land kind of formalized through the Forest Rights Act, most of them actually had very little understanding of the process, and they didn't know if they were entitled to land as well. Overall, I've pretty much met no villagers who knew about their community forest rights, and none of their forest rights had actually been formally recognized. And one of the government officials I spoke to, Srinivas Reddy, who helped orchestrate the post-FRA relocation, said we didn't even think about community rights when we were doing the relocation. And also, the villagers had very incomplete information about what the relocation was going to mean for them. So villagers who were landless didn't know that money was going to be deducted from their 1 million to help compensate landed people for land, make the deal sweeter for them. They also didn't know that the state was going to deduct money from their 1 million to help pay for their house plots and the roads and electricity in the new site. They thought they were getting it for free. They didn't know how much they were going to get from interest off of the $500,000 they had in their fixed deposit account, which is a key piece of information because that was going to be their main source of income. And they didn't know that years could pass after the relocation before they got the infrastructure that they were promised. And I think the most interesting thing is actually has to do with the money itself. So in 2007, 2008, when villagers initially agreed to relocate, 1 million rupees was worth a lot more. So Nanda Thackeray said that back in 2007, 2008, sugar cost about 13 rupees a kilogram, and land cost about 100,000 rupees an acre. And today, sugar costs about 30 or 32 rupees a kilogram, and it would take a whole 1 million rupees, 10 lakh, to purchase an acre of land. So they said they agreed to the relocation on the mistaken assumption that the relocations would occur soon. So was consent informed? No. Unfortunately, without knowledge of their rights, Adivasi were not very well equipped to resist the disadvantageous aspects of relocations, and neither the government nor the NGOs effectively helped tribals understand the Forest Rights Act and what they were entitled to. I also want to mention some other problems with the process of providing consent. So even tribal activists are a big fan of Gram Sabha consent because they believe that it's a traditional decision-making apparatus, and for some reason that should be good. But from what I can tell, Gram Sabhas aren't very democratic bodies. Only a small number of people seem to even express their opinion at these meetings when they're talking about whether they should relocate or not. Women may attend, but they seldom speak. And even when the government or the state orders villagers to include women more often or better, they don't do a very good job. A couple of women told me that they were opposed to relocation, but they were afraid to speak out about their concerns in public because some of the people who were most pro-relocation were heavy drinkers who really wanted that money quickly. And so they were afraid that they'd be hurt if they were to speak out. And most amazing to me, in the largest democracy in the world, there is no formal voting process. So basically, people are sitting there in a meeting, and one gentleman said, whenever there are a lot of people shouting, folks think, wow, there's so many people who want to go. And then they assume that the majority of people want to go, right? Whereas there's a lot of reason that there's a silent majority who doesn't want to say anything. So that's sort of a problem. Anyway, so the next question I addressed was how the relocations affected socioeconomic metrics in the villages. Now, so obviously this isn't the voluntary relocation we were all hoping for, but I think it's quite plausible that this quasi-voluntary model of relocation is the most likely form to scale across India. And so it's good to know what it means for the tribals. So I adopted as many questions as possible from the Demographic and Health Survey, which is an established instrument in public health, and I tried to look at several areas. First, vocation and income. Secondly, I tried to assess how assets in relocated villages and infrastructure in relocated villages compared to villages that hadn't been relocated. Looked at health and education, and I also just asked them about their overall quality of life. And in addition, I used qualitative interviews to explore some of the reasons for differences in outcomes that I found. So, I should make a note here. So basically, as I present the results for this part of the talk, I'm going to kind of break up results in a couple of ways. One is I'm going to talk about the results for the pre-Forest Rights Act villages, which are the 3 villages relocated in 2000, and the post-Forest Rights Act villages, which are the 2 villages I looked at that were relocated from 2010 to 2012. And those villages combined are the relocated villages. So in some cases, I'll separate the 2 different types of relocations, and in other cases, I'll lump them together. And then the forest villages are sort of my control villages. And those are the ones that are still in the forest. And I have the sample sizes here on the right. I'm not gonna refer to them again, so memorize them. But give or take 5. So I want to note that I'm aware that the relocated villages were not a random sample of villages that were taken from the forest, right? So there's some endogeneity problems that I'll talk about later. But the forests are as good a control as they had, and I think they're instructive for other reasons. So, okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is vocation and income. So villagers living in a protected area essentially have 3 main likely sources of income. One is if you own land, you can grow crops and sell the crops and feed yourself as well. 2, if you own livestock, enough livestock, you can herd them and just live off the income that comes from selling the milk. Third, and these are the landless people I talked about earlier, if you have neither land nor large herds of livestock, you have to do wage labor. Either you have to do labor within the village working at other farms, or you can migrate outside the jungle for parts of the year and do work on farms and industry outside. So what I have here, this bar chart is basically the average number of acres or the number of acres per person in each household in the villages that are still in the forest, the pre-Forest Rights Act relocated villages, and the post-Forest Rights Act relocated villages. And so you kind of see that the folks who are relocated early on, because they got land for land compensation, they still have land, right? They haven't lost it. And this is relatively similar to the amount of land that was had per person, per family in the forest. But you can see here that the people who were relocated more recently, who were given cash compensation, were not able to convert that money to land. Probably in part because of what we saw earlier. The cost of land was so high that it didn't make sense to give up all your savings for half an acre or 1 acre. There's one village I should note that is an exception, based on the government data, that's Vadi. And in Vadi, people from the village figured out that if they cross the state border to Madhya Pradesh, they can get really cheap land, and so they've done that. So now, if you happen to be one of the villagers that did get land, it's clearly better to be outside the forest, and here's why. There are a lot fewer wild animals to come and steal your soy, sorghum, and other crops. Right? So you can see that if you are in the forest, the median proportion of your crops that you think you're losing is around between 0.2 and 0.3, or 20 to 30%. And same true with sorghum and soy. If you're relocated, most villagers said we're not really losing any of our crops to the crop raiders. So that's one advantage of leaving the forest if you get land. Okay, so the next thing is livestock. So what we did is we asked all the tribal households how many domestic cattle and domestic buffalo they had in their home. And on average, households inside the forest had 3.7 domestic bovids per home, and there was 1.2 domestic bovids per household in the post-Forest Rights Act relocated villages. And the difference is statistically significant. And what I found, I don't have a whole lot of faith in this data, but my data suggests that for people who've moved outside the forest and have kept their bovids, they're actually not making enough in milk sales to make up for the amount that they're paying for fodder, because they no longer have access to a forest to feed their animals. Okay, so far this is kind of a bleak story, right? Because especially if you're more recently relocated, you didn't get land, and you have fewer animals than you did before. But luckily, villagers report having more work opportunities outside the forest than they did before. And this is, I think, particularly notable for women. So that's what the Dandeker said, that they used to stay at the house in the old village, but now that they've relocated, they can go somewhere for work, and they meet other people, and for them, in that sense, the relocation has been beneficial. So what it seems, and I should also note that, remember, these people are getting interest from their 500,000 rupees that are kept in their fixed deposit account every month. So it looks like there's some gains, some losses. You're no longer getting agricultural income, and you're no longer getting income from selling milk or having livestock. But you are getting income maybe from more labor opportunities and from the bank. So we want to see in net whether you had higher or lower income if you relocated, right? So what we did is so I'm not an economist, so I may be flying by the seat of my pants here, but I said this is discretionary income. Discretionary income is agricultural income plus labor income plus income you get from any small businesses that you have plus the interest you get from the bank minus the amount you pay for fuel and the amount you're paying for food, right? And so I want to say that this data is not very precise. So if you go and ask a tribal villager how much they make in a year, they're like, who keeps track of that, right? Because they, some days they get work, some days they don't. They don't get a pay stub at the end of the month. So in that sense, these are definitely estimates, but hopefully the averages still tell us something informative. And what we found is that for the pre-Forest Relocation, pre-Forest Rights Act relocations, they seem to have about 4,450 rupees per person left over at the end of the year after they've paid for fuel and food. After the Forest Rights Act, it's a higher amount of 6,700 rupees, probably in large part because of the money they're getting from interest. And in the forest villages, it's just about 1,160 rupees. Now, obviously, if you're in the forest, there's some things you get for free, you don't have to pay for as much, like mushrooms and that kind of thing. But still, that's a significant difference. And it looks like the forest, despite the kind of the high variation, post-Forest Rights Act relocations are making more, significantly more than the forest villages. And even for the numbers that seem really realistic, like this one, this negative 20,000 rupees per person, that's actually, you can be, if a villager was often telling me how much they made or how much they're spending by $1 a day, that adds up to about that much, right, for each family member. Okay, so what about other assets and infrastructure? So the relocation seems to mean better houses. So if you were relocated, you're more likely to have a home that has cement bricks, cement or brick walls than just kind of thatch walls or mud walls. And you're more likely to have a floor that is finished or made of concrete or cement. However, that's sort of where the benefits seem to tail off. There's no real difference in access to electricity. And the relocated villages, despite being promised sort of pipe water and tap water, are still accessing their water from wells, and they have about the same amount of water. They have water available to them about the same portion of the year as villages that are still in the forest. And I think perhaps more problematically, there's this graph on the proportion of households that have toilets after relocation. So there isn't really too much of a change. And if you live in the forest and you practice open defecation, it's actually, assuming you don't get snuck upon by a tiger, it's okay, right? Because there aren't a lot of people around, you can get your privacy. And it's maybe not so unhygienic because you can get pretty far from your village before you do the deed. However, if you are in a post-FRA relocation, and you're essentially being given a small plot of land in a matrix of agricultural land, where do you go, right? You're either going to end up going on someone else's land, and then and they get upset when you're using the bathroom in their area, or you're gonna defecate really close to where you live, and that can be unhygienic. Alright, so the other thing we asked about was transportation and access to markets. So pretty much across the board, villagers said that they had better access to transportation and to fresh vegetables every day and that sort of thing than they did when they were in post-relocation, than they did when they were in the forest. But there's one really striking exception that I have to mention, and that's Darud. So the village of Darud was relocated in 2012, And in 2013, when I went to do my work, they still didn't have a paved road leading from the village to the main road that would allow them access to markets. And what that meant is that during the monsoons, the road would flood, the mud road, the dirt road would flood, and they ended up actually more isolated than they would have been if they had stayed in their original village. And this led to some tragic consequences. One woman I spoke to had a grandchild, just 10 days old, that fell ill during the monsoons. They called an ambulance. The ambulance got stuck in the dirt, in the mud road on the way to the village, and the child died in the next 4 or 5 hours. And you can imagine just how angry this woman was, because she had relocated in part because she thought she was going to have better access to modern services, and instead, she lost her grandchild. As far as education goes, relocation did not seem to change the portion of children in school. Relocated villagers were paying about 50% more per student post-relocation. They're paying more for school fees, for uniform, for school supplies, and for transportation. But I actually think that them paying more is because A, they had more money, and B, because they felt now that they could access better school systems or better schools. And so 2/3 of the villagers that were relocated said they felt that the quality of education was better post-relocation than it was before. 23% said there's no difference. A few villagers even made comments like this. One guy said, my kids couldn't even write their